In the grand, unforgiving ledger of life, love is the most volatile asset. It enters your accounts with the force of a market boom, promising infinite returns, and you, a fool drunk on potential, leverage everything you have against it. I know this because I was that fool. And Sandra was the market crash I never saw coming. I remember her entry into my life not as a meet cute, but as an audit. I was a junior accountant then, a man of precise figures and predictable outcomes, existing in a world shaded in grayscale. My life was a balance sheet, my meager salary on one side, my Spartan expenses on the other. There was little room for variance. Then she walked in. It was some dreary corporate mixer, the air thick with the smell of cheap wine and cheaper ambitions. I was a ghost in the machine, a background figure. But the way she looked at me, it was like she was performing a forensic analysis of my soul and found, to her surprise, something of value. Her gaze wasn't a glance, it was an acquisition. In a room full of men preening and posturing, she saw me, Victor, the man who knew how to make the numbers add up, and decided I was an undervalued stock worth investing in. She had an energy that defied physics, a human supernova that pulled everything into its orbit. I, a quiet, methodical planetoid, was captured instantly. I fell for her not with a stumble, but like a building imploding, a controlled demolition of the self I thought I knew. I was certain I'd found my partner, the co-signer on the loan of a lifetime. We were, in those nascent days, the very definition of a bootstrap startup. Us against the world, armed with nothing but ramen noodles and a shared, feverish dream. I didn't have much, but what I had, I liquidated for her. My time, a non-renewable resource, was poured into her happiness. My devotion, the bedrock of my character, became the foundation upon which she built her fantasies. My dreams for a better future, once modest and achievable, were rewritten to match her sprawling, architectural ambitions. Sandra, for her part, was the charismatic CEO. She didn't deal in spreadsheets or overtime. She dealt in narrative. "We'll make it, Victor," she'd murmur, her voice a hypnotic prospectus, as we sat on our lumpy, second-hand couch. "One day, we'll rise so far above this they'll need telescopes to see us." Those words were my fuel, the high-octane blend that powered me through 18-hour days and nights spent wrestling with other people's finances. Our wedding wasn't a gala. It was a quiet merger. A small ceremony at a local church, witnessed by a handful of friends and family who represented our starting capital. But it felt like the deal of the century. She held my hand at the altar with the grip of a woman sealing a contract, a silent addendum that read, "I'm with you, no matter what." I believed her. Oh, how I underwrote that belief with every fiber of my being. We started small. Our first home was a modest 2-bedroom apartment, a fixer-upper of a life furnished with the ghosts of other people's possessions. Our shared bank account was a delicate ecosystem, perpetually on the verge of collapse. But I told myself it didn't matter. The asset column was overflowing with US, and that, I reasoned, was enough to offset any deficit. I'd skip lunch, telling myself it was intermittent fasting, just to squirrel away a few extra dollars for the life she sketched in the air with her elegant hands. Sandra's ambitions were not small. She didn't want comfort, she wanted conquest. She collected lifestyle magazines like they were blueprints, pointing to sprawling estates and opulent interiors. "Victor," she would say, her eyes gleaming with the reflection of a glossy page. "One day, I'll host parties in a house so grand, people will write about it. We'll be a dynasty." I'd laugh, a sound that even then felt a little hollow, and promise her we'd get there. I had no idea how. I just knew that I, the diligent accountant, would work myself down to the bone to fund her vision. And I did. I was a machine of relentless production. I took on extra shifts, freelanced until my eyes burned, and when a major expense loomed, I sold the one thing of real sentimental value I owned, the worn, reliable car my father had left me. It felt like selling a piece of my past to finance a future I was beginning to doubt I'd recognize. While I was grinding numbers, Sandra was grinding social gears. She polished her charm until it was a blinding, irresistible force. She networked, she schmoozed, she ascended. With breathtaking speed, she maneuvered her way into social circles that operated on a currency I couldn't compute. I watched, proud and a little bewildered, thinking she was laying the groundwork for our shared future, our dynasty. I was a fool. She wasn't building for us. She was securing a solo venture, and I was merely the initial, and ultimately disposable, seed capital. Looking back through the clear, cold lens of hindsight, the red flags were there, fluttering like warning pennants in a gathering storm. They were small at first. The way she started referring to her new associates as my friends, a subtle but significant linguistic shift from our friends. The way her phone, once a shared portal to our world, became a private, guarded fortress. The way her laughter, when I recounted a small victory at work, sounded like polite, distant applause from a box seat high above the stage. But I ignored the data. I was emotionally overleveraged, and to admit the truth would be to admit my own catastrophic miscalculation. I clung to the memory of the couple on the second-hand couch, dreaming of a future while the scent of instant noodles filled the air. I wanted to believe we were still a going concern. The breaking point, the event that pushed our fragile enterprise into insolvency, was the renovation. It was Sandra's idea, of course. A hostile takeover of our shared reality. It's an investment, Victor, she'd purred, her voice a silken noose. To entertain the right people, we need the right backdrop. You'll see. It will pay dividends. Her persuasion was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. I, the man of caution and fiscal responsibility, took out a loan. A hefty one. A mountain of debt that cast a long, cold shadow over my life. Our modest home, a place of comfortable, shared history, was gutted. It became a showroom, a stage set for a life we weren't living. Chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen tears. Marble countertops, cold and unforgiving to the touch, replaced the warm, scarred wood we'd shared countless meals on. Imported rugs smothered the floors, silencing my footsteps as I walked through the hollow, echoing rooms. The house was stunning, a testament to Sandra's impeccable, ruthless taste. But it was no longer a home. It was a corporate headquarters, and I was beginning to feel like a low-level employee. Sandra, however, blossomed in this new, sterile environment. She hosted her first party shortly after the last contractor left. Watching her float through the rooms, a champagne flute in hand, her laughter echoing off the cold marble, you would think she'd been born to this world. She was the queen of a kingdom I had built but could no longer enter. Even then, blinded by the glare of the new light fixtures, I didn't question her loyalty. I didn't question her love. I should have. That party was the beginning of the end. The official, ribbon-cutting ceremony for my own destruction. I just didn't know it yet. They say love is blind. They forget to mention it's also deaf and dumb, a willing participant in its own deception. I didn't hear the whispers that followed me like a chill draft whenever Sandra introduced me. Oh, this is my husband, Victor. The emphasis on husband was always a little too pronounced, as if it were a title of curiosity, like the groundskeeper or the help. I didn't register the snickers from her new, glossy friends, men with soft hands and predatory smiles. I didn't see the hairline cracks spiderwebbing across the foundation of our marriage because I was too busy working, patching the walls of our financial life with my own blood, sweat, and sacrifice. After the renovation, the debt was a physical presence. It sat on my chest at night, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. My steady job, once a source of pride, was now just a single, insufficient tributary feeding a raging river of expenses. The lifestyle Sandra had constructed, or rather, the meticulously curated image she projected, was a voracious beast. Lavish dinners I wasn't invited to, designer outfits worn once and then discarded, endless parties where the champagne flowed like water. None of it was cheap. I didn't complain. Complaining would have been an admission of failure. Instead, I retreated further into my work, picking up more freelance gigs, becoming a ghost haunting the late-night hours of the city. My world shrank to the dimensions of a spreadsheet. Sandra would sometimes drift into my home office, a fragrant, beautiful apparition, and say, "Victor, you're such a hard-working man." But her tone was hollow, the detached praise one might offer a particularly efficient appliance. She wasn't speaking to a husband. She was addressing the engine that powered her glittering world. I would smile, a rictus of exhaustion, and tell her it was all for us. But deep down, a cold dread was beginning to crystallize in my gut. I was a shadow in my own home, a name on a bank account. The thing about drowning is that you don't realize how tired you are. You just keep kicking, fighting for one more breath, until your limbs turn to lead and the abyss beckons. My moment of realization came one Tuesday night. I dragged myself home after a 14-hour day, my body aching, my mind a numb fog of numbers. I opened the door not to a quiet sanctuary, but to a wall of sound. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. Another impromptu gathering. The house was teeming with strangers, a flock of brightly colored birds of prey who had descended upon my nest. Sandra was at the epicenter, of course. She was wearing a shimmering dress I'd never seen before, one that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She looked every bit the queen of her self-created kingdom. When she finally spotted me lingering in the doorway, a phantom at my own feast, her smile faltered for a microsecond. It was a flicker of annoyance, quickly masked. She glided over. "Victor, you're home," she said, her voice light, but her eyes were cold, issuing a silent warning. Asterisk, do not make a scene. Do not embarrass me. Asterisk, why didn't you tell me you'd be late? The question was an absurdity. I was always late. I mumbled something about a deadline. She didn't press. She didn't care. She gave my arm a perfunctory pat, a gesture devoid of warmth, and then turned back to her adoring court. Later that night, as I sat alone in our cavernous, cold bedroom, the distant sounds of the party bleeding through the walls, the truth finally landed. It wasn't a slow dawning. It was a sudden, brutal impact. Sandra didn't see me anymore. I wasn't a person. I was a utility, a resource to be exploited. I thought about confronting her, about storming downstairs and demanding an explanation. But what would I say? I had no tangible proof, no smoking gun. All I had was a profound, gut-wrenching feeling that the woman I loved was a stranger, and I was just the financier for her new life. The turning point, the moment my denial finally shattered, came a few weeks later. I'd stayed up, chasing a freelance deadline, the house silent around me. Then I heard her voice from the living room, a low, conspiratorial murmur. She was on the phone. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but her words snagged me like fishhooks. "Victor just doesn't understand ambition," she said, her voice dripping with a contempt so pure it was crystalline. "He's comfortable. He's content being mediocre. A ballast, not a sail. I can't live tethered to a man like that forever. Mediocre." Asterisk, the word didn't just cut, it eviscerated. After all the years, all the sacrifice, all the nights I'd worked until dawn to build her a palace, I was mediocre. A weight holding her back. I wanted to burst into the room, to scream, to shatter the fragile peace of the house. But I didn't. I sat there in the dark, the glow of my laptop illuminating my frozen face, replaying her words until they were burned into my memory. That night, something inside me shifted. The weary, love-blinded man died, and someone else, colder and more pragmatic, began to stir. I couldn't keep running on this treadmill of sacrifice while she kept moving the finish line. I wasn't ready to detonate our marriage, not yet. But I knew, with the certainty of a final, audited number, that I had to protect myself. So I began to make quiet changes. I opened a separate bank account, a secret ledger. With the precision of a seasoned accountant, I started funneling small, untraceable amounts of my freelance income into it. A contingency fund, an escape hatch. I started monitoring our joint accounts with a new, dispassionate intensity, tracking every purchase, noting every extravagance. I was no longer a husband. I was an auditor of my own life. I even started a small consulting business on the side, a completely separate entity under a different name. It was my lifeboat, a small vessel in a turbulent sea. Sandra never noticed. She was too consumed by her social calendar, too busy being the star of her own show. But the true pain wasn't her neglect. It was the crushing indifference. Every time she laughed a little too hard at another man's joke, every time she brushed off my attempts to connect with a wave of her hand, it was another brick in the wall she was methodically constructing between us. I told myself it was a rough patch, a market correction. But I knew the truth. Sandra wasn't looking back. She was already charting a course for her next horizon, and I was just the dead weight she hadn't yet figured out how to cut loose. That night is not a memory. It is a scar, etched onto the tissue of my mind. It didn't just hurt, it cauterized. It was the night Sandra held her grandest party, the one she'd been planning for weeks, hyping it as the event of the season. It was, I would learn, her declaration of independence, and I was to be the sacrificial lamb. When I arrived home, the house had been transformed into something unrecognizable, a lavish stage set for my own public execution. The chandeliers weren't just lit. They blazed, scattering fractured diamonds of light across the faces of strangers. Music, some soulless, minimalist jazz, pulsed from hidden speakers. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and canapes. Sandra had spared no expense. My expense. Her friends, a coterie of the city's vapid and wealthy, were all there, draped in designer fabrics and dripping with jewels. And at the center of it all, a predatory planet in her orbit, was Alex. The man whose presence at these gatherings had become a constant, nagging dissonance in the symphony of my life. He was everything I was not, slick, smooth-tongued, and radiating an aura of effortless, unearned confidence. I stood in the grand doorway, a ghost at the feast, clutching a small, velvet box. Inside was a diamond bracelet. I had saved for months, skimming from my own meager personal allowances, working extra weekends. It was a desperate, foolish gambit. I thought it might be an anchor, something tangible to remind her of the promises we'd made, a tether to the woman I had fallen in love with. When Sandra finally saw me, her face did not light up. There was no wifely rush to greet me. There was a flicker of annoyance, a brief tightening of her jaw, before she offered a weak, dismissive smile and turned back to her conversation with Alex. I was an interruption, an inconvenient footnote. I stood there, marooned in the entryway, feeling the weight of 100 indifferent eyes. Finally, one of her friends, a woman with a face pulled unnaturally tight, noticed me and announced in a voice that cut through the chatter, "Oh, look. Sandra's husband is here." The way she said husband made my skin crawl. It wasn't a statement of fact. It was an accusation. It branded me as the relic, the artifact from a previous, less glamorous life that Sandra inexplicably kept around. Sandra sighed, an audible exhalation of impatience, and drifted toward me. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of forced politeness. "Victor, you're late," she said, her voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the velvet. "I was working," I began, but she cut me off. "You should have told me. You know how important tonight is." I held out the velvet box, my last, pathetic offering. "This is for you." She took it, her movements languid. She opened it, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the old Sandra, a spark of genuine surprise. Then she laughed. It was not a sound of joy. It was a short, cruel bark of derision, sharp and ugly. "A bracelet," she said, her voice amplified by the sudden, expectant silence of the room. She held it up for all to see, letting it dangle from her fingers like a dead thing. "Victor, this is why you'll never understand." Her words hung in the air, a physical blow. The room was utterly still. All eyes, mocking, pitying, scornful, were on me. She wasn't finished. She turned to her audience, to Alex, to her court of sycophants. "You see," she announced, a ringmaster presenting her prize fool. "Victor's idea of ambition is working late to buy trinkets." A nice, safe, little gesture. She glanced at Alex, a shared, secret smile passing between them. Alex, on the other hand, knows what it means to truly live. Alex smirked, a slow, reptilian curl of his lips. The sycophants laughed, a wave of cruel, appreciative sound. I stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer, theatrical brutality of it all. This wasn't an argument. It was a performance. And I was the punchline. Then came the final act. Sandra, with a dramatic flourish, pulled off her wedding ring. The simple gold band I had placed on her finger in that small, hopeful church. She held it up. "This," she said, her voice ringing with finality, "is just a symbol. And a symbol is meaningless if the person who gave it to you doesn't grow with you." And then, she threw it at me. It didn't fly far. It landed at my feet with a soft, metallic clink on the marble floor. For a moment, the world went silent. I couldn't breathe. The laughter that erupted around me was a tidal wave, drowning out everything. Their eyes were like nails, pinning me to the floor. I looked at Sandra, searching her face for any trace of remorse, of the woman I once knew. There was nothing. Only a cold, triumphant gleam. She was basking in this, in my utter and complete humiliation. It was her coronation. My hand shook as I bent down. My fingers closed around the small, warm circle of gold. I slipped it into my pocket. I didn't say a word. What was there to say? The woman I had devoted my life to had just immolated me for sport. I would not give her the satisfaction of my rage or my tears. As I turned to leave, my back straight, my head held high, I heard Alex's voice, slick with condescension, cut through the renewed laughter. Don't worry, Sandra. Some men are meant to build foundations, so others can live in the penthouse. The roar of approval that followed was the final shovelful of dirt on the grave of my marriage. I walked out of that house, out of that life, feeling as though I had been flayed alive. I had left behind more than a party. I had left behind my dignity, my trust, and the last, stubborn ember of love I had held for Sandra. But as I stepped into the cold night air, the shock began to recede, replaced by something else. A strange, glacial calm. The pain was there, a white-hot core in my chest, but surrounding it was a burgeoning, crystalline clarity. I wasn't just humiliated. I was liberated. I was done. Done with her games, her lies, her bottomless, vampiric needs. And in that moment, under the indifferent gaze of the stars, I made a vow. This wasn't over. This was a declaration of war. And I, the quiet, mediocre accountant, was about to conduct the most ruthless audit of her life. When I stepped out of that house, the laughter of hyenas still ringing in my ears, defeat was not the emotion that settled in my soul. It was clarity. A chilling, absolute clarity that cut through years of self-deception like a diamond blade through glass. The fog of love, a dense, cloying vapor that had clouded my judgment and softened the sharp edges of her cruelty, finally lifted. I saw everything for what it was. Sandra hadn't just humiliated me. She had attempted to erase me, to reduce the sum of my existence to a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. I drove that night with no destination, the ghost of a ring in my pocket, a cold, hard repudiation of a decade of my life. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, but my mind was unervingly calm. I parked by a deserted park overlooking the glittering, indifferent city. The skyline was a monument to ambition, a jagged EKG of 1,000 striving hearts. For years, I had striven for her. Now, I would strive for myself. How did it get this bad? The question surfaced, a bubble of the old, wounded Victor. But the new Victor, the one forged in the crucible of public disgrace, answered it without sentiment. It hadn't gotten bad. It had been bad for a very long time. I had simply been too busy balancing the books to read the writing on the wall. I had been the willing fool, making excuses, patching holes, believing that my unwavering investment would eventually yield a return. Tonight, Sandra had made the terms of our partnership brutally clear. I was not a partner. I was a liability to be jettisoned. It was time to stop being the victim. It was time to become the architect of my own survival. My phone felt cool and solid in my hand. I logged into our joint bank account. I was the one who managed the finances, the tedious back-end work that bored Sandra. She saw money as an abstract concept, a magical wellspring that funded her desires. She never bothered with the details. Her ignorance was about to become my greatest weapon. The numbers on the screen represented years of my life. Savings painstakingly accrued, investments carefully nurtured, the deposits from endless overtime hours. With surgical precision, I accessed the secondary account, the one I'd opened years ago as a just-in-case fund. My lifeline. One by one, I initiated the transfers. Not everything. That would be too simple, too emotional. I left her a fraction, just enough to make her believe she still had something. Enough for her to feel the shock when the well finally ran dry, but not enough to sustain the life she so desperately craved. It was a calculated move. This wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about asset protection. My survival. Once the funds were secure, I started digging. Our shared email, a digital attic of our life together. I searched for Alex's name. The results were a cascade of betrayal. Receipts for extravagant gifts I hadn't approved. Invoices for consulting fees paid to his failing business. She hadn't just been spending my money. She had been actively siphoning it, propping up her lover with the sweat of my labor. I forwarded every damning email to a new, secure address, creating a digital folder I labeled simply, Evidence. It was my insurance policy. It was power. As dawn broke, streaking the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, a plan had formed in my mind, as clear and structured as a financial statement. I would not confront her in a fit of rage. That's what she would expect. She would twist my pain, weaponize my emotions, and paint herself as the victim of an unhinged husband. No, my response would be quiet, methodical, and utterly devastating. I would handle this like a hostile takeover. First, financial independence was secured. The funds I had moved were my new beginning. Second, the evidence I had gathered would be my shield. If she tried to destroy me in the divorce, she would have to contend with the mountain of her own documented deceit. And third, timing. Timing was everything. Sandra had built her entire world on the shifting sands of image and perception. The higher she climbed, the more spectacular her fall would be. All I had to do was wait, and with a few well-placed nudges, let her self-immolate. Sitting in the car, watching the city awaken, I felt a sense of control I hadn't experienced in years. I was no longer a reactor. I was an actor. Sandra thought she had broken me. She thought she had won. But what she had done was far more profound. She had untethered me. She had set me free. The next morning, I woke up with the clarity of a man who has survived a near-fatal wreck. The world looked different, sharper. I knew what I had to do. Sandra had spent years leveraging my love against me, and I had allowed it. The account was now closed. It was time to collect on the debt. I began the day not with grief, but with a forensic audit of our life. Bank statements, credit card activity, investment portfolios. Sandra thought she was clever, hiding her indulgences under vague categories like household expenses or social engagements. But I was an accountant. Patterns were my language, and hers screamed infidelity and fraud. The first move was to fortify my position. The money I had siphoned into my private account, once a safety net, was now my war chest. With a few clicks, I transferred the remaining bulk of our joint funds into it. It wasn't theft. Every penny was a testament to my sacrifice. I had earned it, and I would not let it be used to fund her fantasies with Alex. Next, the credit cards. They were her lifeblood, the plastic keys to her kingdom of excess. I called each company, reported the cards as compromised, which, in a way, they were, and had them frozen. I pictured her at a designer boutique, a triumphant purchase in hand, only to be met with the quiet, devastating shame of a declined transaction. The thought brought a grim, fleeting smile to my face. But I was just getting started. I knew Sandra's next move would be to panic and try to access our joint investments. I preempted her. I contacted our financial advisor, explaining that I had discovered significant discrepancies and potential fraudulent activity linked to the account. I didn't have to lie. Her funneling of money to Alex was, by any definition, fraud. The firm, eager to avoid liability, immediately placed a temporary freeze on all assets pending a full investigation. By mid-morning, I had done what Sandra, in her arrogant dismissal of my capabilities, never thought possible. I had seized control of the board. As I worked, I recalled the snippets of conversation I'd overheard. Sandra and Alex, cocooned in their smug superiority, believed they were untouchable. She had called me a man with no ambition. But ambition isn't always loud. It isn't always about parties and prestige. Sometimes, ambition is the quiet, methodical resilience of a man preparing to protect himself. That day had arrived. This was about more than money. It was about reclaiming the dignity she had stripped from me and held up for public ridicule. She called me mediocre, a stepping stone. What she failed to understand was that a stepping stone is part of the foundation. And when you remove a critical piece of the foundation, the entire glittering, unstable structure comes crashing down. That afternoon, I decided to widen the demolition zone. I had been keeping a casual file on Alex. Nothing obsessive, just the due diligence of a cautious man. He was a peacock, all flash and feathers, but his financials were a disaster. A series of failed ventures, a mountain of personal debt. He was a con artist, and Sandra was his latest mark. I made a few anonymous calls. A tip to one of Alex's more aggressive creditors, hinting that their debtor had recently come into a significant, though undeclared, source of funds through a third party. A quiet word with a contact at a financial investigation bureau. I planted seeds of doubt and suspicion, providing just enough information to trigger alarms. By the end of the week, the comfortable world Alex had built for himself would be under a microscope he could not withstand. For Sandra, I left a different kind of trap. A breadcrumb trail of manufactured evidence. On our shared home computer, I created a folder containing several cleverly forged documents. Loan applications in her name that Alex had supposedly initiated, email drafts from him to other investors that spoke of leveraging her assets. It wasn't entirely false. It was exactly the kind of thing he would do, but these documents would be the catalyst. They would force her to confront the reality that her dashing partner was not just using her, but potentially ruining her. If I knew Sandra, and I did, her colossal pride would never allow her to be seen as the fool. As I finalized my preparations, a strange sense of calm settled over me. This wasn't the hot-blooded rage of a spurned lover. This was the cold, precise justice of a balancer of books. She had spent years making withdrawals from my life, emotionally and financially. It was time for an accounting. That evening, I took her wedding ring from my pocket. I stared at it, turning the simple gold band over in my fingers. Once, it had been a symbol of our partnership, a promissory note of a shared future. Now, it was just an object, a relic of a failed merger. I placed it on the dining table, the centerpiece of a home that was no longer ours. It wasn't my burden to carry anymore. I don't know what I expected when I walked back into the house the next morning, but it was worse than I could have imagined. It was the aftermath of a decadent battle. The air, thick with stale cigarette smoke and spilled wine, was a physical assault. Half-empty glasses and overflowing ashtrays littered every surface. The pristine white rug was stained. It was a perfect metaphor for our marriage, a beautiful facade, now revealed to be a filthy, chaotic mess. Sandra was on the couch, a dethroned queen amidst the ruins of her kingdom. She was still in last night's dress, now rumpled and stained. Her makeup was a smeared, tragic mask. Alex was beside her, his usual smirk replaced by a sullen pout as he scrolled numbly through his phone. A few of the party's stragglers were still there, passed out in chairs like casualties of war. My entrance broke the tableau. Sandra's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom. "What are you doing here?" she spat. The question, given that my name was on the deed, was breathtaking in its audacity. I set my briefcase down on the coffee table, the sharp click of the latches a sound of authority in the disheveled room. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to marinate in their own squalor. "We need to talk," I said finally, my voice calm and firm. Sandra rolled her eyes. "Victor, if this is about last night, just save it. You embarrassed yourself, not me." I ignored the barb. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder, thick with documents. I placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "You might want to take a look at this." She hesitated, her arrogance warring with her curiosity. Curiosity won. She opened the folder. I watched her face as she flipped through the pages. The expression shifted through a rapid, fascinating series of emotions, from annoyance to confusion, to dawning horror, and finally, to pure, undiluted panic. What is this?" she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "It's a detailed accounting," I said, my tone neutral, clinical, "of every dollar you funneled from our joint account into Alex's various failing enterprises, along with a summary of his other, rather substantial, personal debts and the list of creditors who are now actively looking for him. I also took the liberty of including some documents I found that suggest he's been using your name to secure personal loans. I thought you deserved to know what your new partner has been up to." Alex shot up from the couch. "What the hell are you talking about?" I turned my gaze to him, cold and flat. "Oh, don't play dumb, Alex. You've been using Sandra as your personal ATM. A very generous one, I might add. But the bank is closed. And I have a feeling your other creditors are about to come calling. I'm sure they'd love to hear about the lavish lifestyle you've been enjoying on someone else's dime." Sandra's hands were trembling as she stared at the forged loan applications. She looked up at me, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. You did this." "No, Sandra," I said, my voice rising just enough to command the room. You did this. You and him. I just brought the receipts." The room, which had been silent, erupted. Sandra rounded on Alex, screeching accusations, holding up the papers as proof of his betrayal. Alex, cornered and exposed, tried to bluster his way out of it, but the evidence was too damning. Her remaining friends, now awake and alert, began murmuring, their expressions shifting from hungover indifference to alarm as they realized the gilded world they inhabited was collapsing around them. "You think you can just humiliate me like this?" Sandra shrieked, turning her fury back to me. Her face was mottled with rage. The dam of my composure finally broke, not with a flood, but with a single, powerful wave of cold truth. "Humiliate you," I repeated, my voice ringing with incredulity. "You stood in this very room last night, in front of everyone, and you called me a nobody. You called me mediocre. You threw my ring, *our* ring, at my feet while your lover and your friends laughed. You didn't just humiliate me, Sandra. You tried to annihilate me. And now you have the audacity to play the victim?" She opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. "No, you don't get to speak. You don't get to turn this around. You made your choices. You chose to betray, to lie, to steal. These," I said, gesturing to the folder, to the wreckage of the room, to her crumbling life, "are the consequences." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Alex was stunned into submission. I picked up my briefcase. As I turned to leave, I looked back at Sandra one last time, her face a ruin of smeared mascara and shattered pride. "You told me I was a nobody," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "But a nobody wouldn't have seen this coming. A nobody wouldn't have protected himself. And a nobody certainly wouldn't be the one walking away with his dignity intact. Goodbye, Sandra." As I walked out the door and into the clean morning air, I heard the first sounds of her primal scream of rage and despair directed at Alex. I didn't look back. For the first time in a very long time, I felt completely, utterly, and blessedly free.